Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining this session, Oceans and Seas equal to SDG 14, Sustainable Development Goal 14, and a Smart Future. We have altogether four invited speakers, prominent speakers, who will share something related to their field of expertise. First, we will have Rear Admiral Luigi Sinapi from Monaco, followed by Professor Lisa Campbell from United States of America, then Dr. Virginie Tassin Capanella from Switzerland, and last but not least, Captain Brian Conan from United States of America. So we will start first with Rear Admiral Luigi Sinapi. Let me just read Rear Admiral Luigi Sinapi biodata. Rear Admiral Luigi Sinapi was born in Grosseto, Italy on August 27, 1967. He joined the Naval Academy in Livorno, Italy in 1985. Rear Admiral Sinapi was commanding officer for various vessels and survey vessels of the Italian Navy. He is the director of the Italian Hydrographic Institute from October 2015 to July 2020. From 1st September 2020, Rear Admiral Sinapi has been elected the International Hydrographic Organization, or in short IHO, director for 6 years. Rear Admiral Sinapi taught hydrography and geodesy at the Partenope University, Naples, Italy, and has published a number of essays in national and international journals and reviews. He has been member of a number of technical and scientific national and international committees in the fields of navigation, cartography, marine geophysics, and oceanography. He chaired the IHO MBSHC, Mediterranean and Black Sea Hydrographic Commission from 2017 to 2019 in the IHO HSSC, Hydrographic Services and Standard Committee from 2017 to 2020. Rear Admiral Sinapi is married to Dr. Loredana Lipoli and has two sons, Giovanni and Angelo. His hobbies are navigation, sailing, basketball, and tennis. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to invite Rear Admiral Luigi Sinapi to give his presentation. Over to you, Admiral.
So thank you very much, Professor Maud Razali Mahmoud, and thank you very much for all your assistance, also the technical assistance, due to my very poor knowledge on these systems. And I would like to thank all the organizers of this FIG e-working week 2021. I prepared a presentation for this my intervention, and I kindly ask you to help me in sending out this presentation. As a preface, I would like to remind that the IHO, which I represent, and the FIG signed a memorandum of understanding in 2003 for the purpose of maintaining and increasing the opportunities of scientific, technical, and professional educational exchange between their members. I will focus my presentation on these 5 points as you show on the agenda, starting from the historical background. Next slide, please. 2 dates are important for the IHO. 1921, when the IHO was founded, thanks to the intuition of His Serene Highness Prince Albert I, with just 19 member states, and since that date, the IHO has had its seat in Monaco. And 2021, the IHO celebrates its first 100 years, always in the Principality of Monaco. And the celebrations were held just 2 days ago, on 21 June 2021, which is the date which coincides with the World Hydrography Day on 21st of June, thanks to a resolution United Nations resolution adopted on 29 November 2005. Next slide, please. And the International Organization, Hydrographic Organization, is an intergovernmental organization that supports the safety of navigation and the protection of the marine environment, with to date 94 member states. While hydrography focuses on the physical characteristics of oceans, coastal areas, lakes, and rivers, and the prediction of their change over time. Surveys record many features, including coastal topography, bathymetry depth, and oceanographic measurements, such as temperature, salinity, tides, and currents. Next slide, please. And as you can read at the top left of the slide, hydrography goes beyond nautical charts. The information gathered in hydrographic surveys has traditionally supported navigation, but now applies to all marine activities, including economic development, security and defense, scientific research, and environmental protection. And the economic benefits of having up-to-date knowledge of the marine environment can be considerable. Not only can hydrographic information be used by countries to develop infrastructures as ports, for instance, but it can also be used to develop the blue economy of a country or region, or ultimately the entire planet. Next slide, please. And among the various tasks and responsibilities, there is also the fundamental one of defining international standards in the fields of training of cartographers and hydrographers. In order to do this, there is a board called IBSC, International Board on Standards of Competence for Hydrographic Surveyors and Nautical Cartographers, constituted by 3 international organizations, IHO, FIG, and ICA, which meets periodically in order to recognize and certify those institutions, to provide certified courses and issue certificate for category A and B cartographers and or hydrographers. At present, there are more than 60 IBSC recognized and certified training programs courses worldwide, and 2 schemes for the maintenance of the related certification. So, as you can see from the next slide, oceans knowledge is becoming increasingly important nowadays. I wanted to show on this slide an image of the seabed and at 10,920 meters below the sea surface. This is the Mariana Trench, which looks very similar to the surface of planets such as the Moon, Venus, and Mars, of which we know far more than most of the seas and oceans of our planet Earth. Lack of knowledge of the marine environment hinders the progress and economic development of most coastal states, which with a negative impact on the exploitation and sustainable management of seas and oceans. In fact, as you can see from the next slide, the list of activities widening from research, development, economic, exploration, disaster prevention, underwater archaeology, to marine information management, maritime spatial planning, and many others, is just a tiny fraction of how fundamental knowledge of the oceans is to safeguarding the most precious asset we have on our planet today, the marine environment, a source of life, development, and prosperity for all humanity. In the last few years, and particularly nowadays, as we can see from the next slide, we are witnessing the proliferation of numerous initiatives in favor of the oceans and the marine environment. Let's look in detail at the 2 main global initiatives in which the IHO is actively involved. First, the Nippon Foundation JEPCO Seabed 2030. Seabed 2030 is a collaborative project between the Nippon Foundation of Japan and the General Bathymetric Charts of the Ocean, JEPCO. It aims to bring together all available bathymetric data to produce the definitive map of the world's ocean floor by 2030 and make it available to all. The second one is the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. The decade represents a participatory and transformative process to that scientists, policymakers, managers, and service users can work together to ensure that ocean science delivers the greatest benefit to both the ocean ecosystem and society. It represents the largest pro-ocean initiative ever launched globally and aims, again by 2030, to move from the ocean we have to the ocean we want to safeguard its life. So, to define the involvement of the IHO in the above mentioned global initiatives in favor of the ocean, next slide, please. This is the IHO strategic plan, recently approved by the second session of the IHO Assembly in November 2020. It will cover a 6-year period from 2021 to 2026, and it is framed in a broader context of the current decade dedicated by the United Nations to the oceans, as we will see later in detail. And it comes from the mission of the IHO that I just described before. I will focus only on the 3 goals, as they describe those areas of interest on which the IHO's activity is focused, and that frame the organization's commitment to safeguarding the marine environment. Goal 1 refers to the evolution and transformation in ensuring the necessary hydrographic support in order to guarantee the safety of navigation in accordance with international regulations in force, the SOLAS regulations. In short, the standard. Goal 2 is focused on the increasing use of hydrographic data for the benefit of society. In short, data, and the necessary infrastructure to ensure the widest dissemination and usability. And goal 3 is related to the participation in global initiatives in favor of the oceans. In synthesis, the knowledge. If we now start to taking the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development initiatives and the 3 objectives, as we start for the next slide, of its implementation plan as reference, let's look in details at the IHO's commitments in the Decade of Oceans. Starting from the objective 1 on the left side of the slide, identify the knowledge needed for sustainable development. Increasing and expanding observation of the marine environment depends on the rapid transfer of new observation technologies into regular, standardized, systematic, and repeatable operations. This is the core competence of hydrographic offices, and the IHO assists the implementation of such measures and facilitates the interregional cooperation through the so-called maritime spatial data infrastructure. Hydrography is sometimes thought to focus only on marine surveys and cartography, but in reality, it goes beyond that. Important physical marine phenomena, such as tides, water column observations, and forecasts, are obtainable from the hydrographic and bathymetric surveys carried out by the National Hydrographic Service. In fact, hydrographic survey and observation infrastructure could be a vector to contribute effectively to providing a comprehensive picture of the global pollution situation and its effect. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example of the involvement of IHO, let me highlight on the concept of MSDI. It's becoming increasingly important today. In the slide, you have a picture showing how many national geoportals in the world are now available, and that are normally managed for the part of a maritime spatial data infrastructure from the hydrographic services. And an MSDI can be described as a structure comprising 4 key components: policy and governments, technical standards, information systems, and geographic contents, as shown in the figure to the left of the slide. We now turn to objective 2 of the Ocean Decade Implementation Plan: generate global knowledge and understanding of the ocean. Global reference bathymetric datasets are developed and made available through JetBook project and its flexible and agile structure, thanks to the IHO Data Center for Digital Bathymetry, DCDB. But IHO does not limit its activities to government agencies, oceanographers, and industrial partners. The IHO Crowdsourced Bathymetry Working Group examines how best to incorporate, manage, and use bathymetric data acquired by other than conventional means, and develops principles and guidelines to enable the collection and appropriate use of the maritime version of citizen science called crowdsourced bathymetry. And finally, capacity building, the process through which the organization, the IHO, assists states to build and develop their own hydrographic, cartographic, and maritime security capacity. Among the capacity building project, let me highlight on a particular one linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically number 5, gender equality. The IHO has recently launched a project in collaboration with Canada. As example, in terms of ocean floor map, there is still much work to do in order to increase the coverage and sharing of hydrographic data. In areas within 200 miles of the coast, it is estimated that only 50% have been surveyed according to modern standards. If we consider the open ocean, only 20.5% is fully known, and we were at just 6% in 2017 when this initiative was launched. And then on capacity building, as I mentioned earlier, the concept of gender equality has taken on particular importance. Next slide, please. In fact, in order to reduce the great imbalance in the participation of women compared to men in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, related maritime domains such as hydrography at all levels, but particularly at the most advanced careers level and in related policies making process, the project Empowering Women in Hydrography has been recently launched by the IHO in collaboration with Canada, as you can see on the slide. And finally, the objective 3 of the UN Ocean Decade Implementation Plan, increase the use of marine knowledge. The current maintenance of existing standards and the development of new ones is driven by the need to improve the safety of navigation and more recently to support the implementation of navigation of IMO. As a result, the IHO has continued to work on the new Universal Data Model S100, as we can see from the next slide. But why the S100 is so important? Next slide, please. In summary, as you can see, it represents a universal standard, leverages technology to achieve safe and efficient navigation, and it is interoperable and is able to represent not only data, but also a multitude of services coming from I would say, from all the marine domains, as you can see in the so-called digital aquarium shown in the slide. So, in conclusion, as you have been able to hear and partially see in the slide, IHO's commitment in the Blue Century is definitely important and embraces several sectors related to the sea. And today, it is not only what has represented for many years the primary interest of the organization, the standardization in the production of nautical chart. Today, the commitment goes further. It aims also, and I would say above all this, at the safeguard of the marine environment through an innovative approach and technologies in collecting and making usable the hydrographic data. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you, Professor, for your assistance during my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Admiral Sinapi. Very fruitful and knowledgeable as far as I'm. For me, as a hydrographic surveyor, it has been a very good, informative presentation by Admiral Sinapi. Before we move on to the next speaker, may I just remind you, you can on the right hand side, you can see the Q&A tab. So please feel free to ask any question regarding whatever question you like to ask. So will be looked at, and after the end of the presentation by the last speaker, then we will have the Q&A session. So now I like to invite our next speaker, Professor Lisa Campbell from United States of America. Let me just first of all read the biodata of Professor Dr. Lisa Campbell. Dr. Lisa Campbell is a Rachel Carson Distinguished Professor of Marine Affairs and Policy, Marine Science and Conservation, Nicholas School of the Environment at the Duke University Marine Lab, Beaufort, United States of America. Dr. Campbell's research focuses on policies and projects designed to reconcile wildlife and other resource conservation with socio-economic development, primarily in rural areas of developing countries. She studies the process of policy making, the transition from policy to practice, and the impacts of and responses to implementation at the local level. At the policy making stage, she examined how the interaction of science and other values and how negotiations between stakeholders, local people, bilateral agencies, NGOs, and experts inform the process. Specific policies include participatory development, community-based conservation, sustainable use, and ecotourism. A major research focus has been on marine turtle conservation policy and its implementation in Latin America and the Caribbean. Dr. Campbell is more generally interested in research methodology, including qualitative methods, interdisciplinary research, and ethics. It is my pleasure now to invite Professor Dr. Lisa Campbell to deliver his presentation. Over to you, Prof.
Microphone is off, Lisa, please.
Okay, my microphone's on now. Can you hear that?
Yes, your microphone is on, but your slides are again on the other mode. Okay.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, shoot. Okay, I'll start again. Thank you for the invitation. I'm a social scientist trained as a human environment geographer. I'm neither a cartographer nor a surveyor, so I wanted to talk a little bit to start about my interest in maps. And overall, I'm primarily interested in the work they do to represent ocean space. However, this interest is really premised on an understanding that maps are never just representations of space or descriptions of space, but they're actually productive of space. So maps play a role in transforming how we think about and imagine oceans, and thus how we think about and imagine possibilities for governing them. So maps and mapping are productive of terrestrial space as well, but I argue that since many people are what Phil Steinberg describes as underexposed to oceans, with limited or no material interactions, representations of oceans through maps and other means are particularly important in how people come to understand these spaces. Maps, stimulate our imagination and inform how society conceptualizes human-ocean relationships and governance possibilities. Contemporary interest in these governance possibilities is really high. There are a number of specific efforts to govern oceans underway, including those on the seafloor, but there's also a more general interest in the blue economy. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development projects that by 2030, the ocean economy will be twice as important to the global economy as it is today. And this explains much of the contemporary interest in oceans, right? Their economic potential. But realizing this interest is often premised on and even requires drawing boundaries and lines to organize marine space for different activities, fisheries, energy, transport, the types of activities shown here. And mapping is one of the key means by which this is achieved. Right, but I've started with the argument that maps that divide marine space are not just representations, but productive. So, what does that mean? So here I'm drawing on work by John Pickles, who says that in representing, maps simultaneously, quote, provide the very conditions of possibility for the worlds we inhabit and the subjects we become. I think marine spatial planning provides a really illustrative example of this understanding of maps and mapping. So this first map is a map of the Netherlands, and it's fairly typical in that the map distinguishes between land and sea, and there's some distinction on land where historically most mapping work has been done. But the sea is an undifferentiated, even blue, and our prior speaker recognized how this is changing. The second map shows the Netherlands Marine Spatial Plan overlaid on top of this space, and it really transforms the seascape, right? It reveals an ocean differentiated by lines, polygons, colors, hatch marks. But the map is not just an input to or a support for management, it is actually management. It doesn't just describe marine space and user groups, but it allocates particular activities to particular spaces. It grants access to some users while restricting access by others. And it is in this function of maps as productive of space that my interests lie. The second and related interest, and the one I'm going to spend most time on today, is on how maps serve within metrological regimes. And in the case I'll describe today, the way maps can be a measure of progress in conservation. So the literature on metrological regimes and practices concerns how measurements and indicators, quote, do not just reflect reality as it is, they create new realities. So you can probably see the similarities in these two theoretical interests in the relationship between how we represent the world, how we describe the world, how we measure it, and how we live in it or govern it. So increasingly, public policy embraces what Esther Turnout has described as measurementality, with government agencies and policymakers focusing on deliverable and measurable outputs of policy rather than their historic interests in policy design or policy making. So there's a lot to be said about the shift itself, generally, where it comes from, what it achieves. But today I want to talk about how that shift has played out and impacted on global efforts to conserve biodiversity. So multilateral organizations like the UN and the Convention on Biological Diversity reflect these shifts, this measurementality, this move to governing by goals over time. And most clearly, it begins in 2000 with the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals, and recently replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, our interest here today. But the Convention on Biological Diversity has often also sort of moved to this approach. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were adopted in 2010. This is the second set of targets-based governance in the CBD, and the third set is currently being negotiated. So in addition to SDG14, I'm going to talk specifically about Aichi Target 11, which is the CBD's target for marine protected areas. So key to governing by goals and getting your goals right, and by right, I mean making them smart, right? Targets and goals need to be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. And the argument is that smart targets can both make and, more importantly here, assess progress, right? There are other arguments for smart targets. They can be more easily communicated. They enhance accountability. But it's the premise of assessing progress that I'm focusing on today. So let's look at SDG 14 and specifically SDG 14.5 on protected areas. So it argues that by 2030, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas. And it has a straightforward indicator, 14.5.1, where we measure progress towards this goal in terms of a ratio of coverage of protected areas in relation to marine areas generally. So it's pretty smart. It's specific and it's 10%. It's measurable via this simple indicator, and it has a deadline. But I would argue it also has an additional benefit. Not only is a measure of progress simple, this ratio, but it's easily shown and thus easily communicated. And we can see progress communicated via maps. So this is a map from 2008 that shows less than 1% of the ocean was protected in marine protected areas. We can fast forward to 2019, where close to 8% of the global ocean is now in MPAs. And I'm just going to annoyingly do that again, from 2008 to 2019. In the world of conservation, this is protected area expansion really at light speed. MPA expansion was facilitated by those things, the easy indicator, the 10%, the timeliness, but also other elements of smartness. First, within conservation organizations, protected areas are really the marquee metric and a privileged solution, if you like, a tradition and favored tool for implementing conservation, which makes it kind of a realistic target because we're not asking conservationists to do things they're unfamiliar with. Secondly, though, in oceans, of course, there was opportunity for expansion. With so little space in protected areas in earlier in the 2000s, there was lots of opportunity to expand protected areas. So for the Sustainable Development Goals specifically, adopted in 2015, the 10% goal was actually seen as not very ambitious because a lot of that progress had already been made under Aichi Target 11. So as a SMART target, it's fairly achievable. And indeed, with the recent release of the Protected Planet Report, which is an analysis by the World Conservation Monitoring Center of progress towards Target 11, the success of Aichi Target 11 was sort of trumpeted in the press. And they're referring, of course, to the CBD's Target 11. Within this tweet, however, there are hints at some complicating factors. So the headline is that Aichi Target 11 has been met. But the caveat is that there is more work to be done to improve the quality of existing and new protected areas. So what does this mean? What are we talking about with quality? And this is where we need to look at Aichi Target 11. So in contrast to SDG 14.5, Aichi Target 11 is somewhat complex. You can see at the beginning a time frame, a 17% of terrestrial area, and a 10% of coastal and marine areas. But then it gets more complicated, and let's just read that. Especially areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem services are conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and integrated into the wider landscape and seascape. So this complexity reflects sort of a decade's worth of negotiations and the evolution of marine protected areas over time. And those negotiations often have developed versus developing countries, arguing about, for example, an area coverage target versus providing the resources to achieve it, but also among those interested in biodiversity contained and protected in protected areas versus those concerned with the well-documented social impacts of protected areas on local communities and indigenous peoples living in their vicinity. So these additions really expand an understanding of what protected areas are or should be. And I'm particularly interested in the addition of concerns about effective and equitable management. So how does this target fit within a metrological regime that really emphasizes the smartness of targets? I would say not very well, but one of the things that we saw after the targets were negotiated, and the target was negotiated really as a whole text, it was broken down into what are referred to as its 6 elements. And here is where the tweet starts to make sense. These 6 elements, which are arguably more specific and might lend themselves to measurement, are evaluated separately. And we see that it's really only the first 2 elements, which are about area coverage, that get the green light. And the other elements of the target have a yellow light, which essentially means that there has been some limited success. I just want to highlight that Aichi Target 11, agreed to in 2010, of course, predates the Sustainable Development Goals adopted in 2015. And so it's a clear reduction. If the marine protected area had expanded over time, the Sustainable Development Goal 14.5 really represents a narrowing back to an emphasis only really on area coverage, easily measured, right? And in some way in doing this, the SDGs kind of ensured the success of this particular goal. I take you back, right? Again, 2008 to 2019. The expansion is visible and it is a success. And within these measurement regimes, you need some successes. If we're going to continue to negotiate things like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Aichi biodiversity targets, having success sort of reinforces the legitimacy of those programs, right? So the 14.5 will and arguably already has been met. But how do we think about or explain lack of success on other areas of the target? And I think there are three ways to think about this, right? I'm just going to focus on element 4, which is this effectively and equitably managed protected areas. In terms of effectiveness, I think we can think of failure or lack of progress in 2 ways. First is in really a failure to measure. So a variety of tools have been developed to assess protected area management effectiveness, including a tool by the World Bank and WWF, which is a protected area management effectiveness tracking tool. Now, while some protected areas have been evaluated, fewer than 20% of CBD signatories, the countries party to the convention, have managed to assess for effectiveness, right? So lack of progress in one sense is understood as an absence of measurement or a failure to measure, even when a tool to measure exists. But a second form of lack of effectiveness is really evident in ineffective management. So for protected areas that have been evaluated, average management effectiveness scores indicated that most or many are not effectively managed. And this suboptimal performance is often tied to issues of funding. When we consider that problem of funding, then we take some of the estimates of what it would cost to expand effective protected areas to a 10 to 30% of oceans. Those numbers are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, which are orders of magnitude beyond what is currently available to the Convention on Biological Diversity for all of its implementation activities, right? So ineffective management is another way that progress has been stalled, and the resources to do effective management are kind of a little bit daunting. Finally, though, in terms of equity, we come to the problem of lack of measurability, or if we measure, what does it actually mean? For equity, there is currently no agreed upon standardized methodology to track progress towards equity. So it hasn't been formalized, it hasn't been operationalized in relation to Target 11, but there are efforts to develop tools to assess equitable management of protected areas. But the task is generally seen as difficult, and an additional complication is that most existing efforts to assess both effectiveness and equity is that they're based on self-assessment by managers, staff, and NGOs involved with protected areas management. So for equity in particular, a history of negative social impacts on people or the power imbalances among park managers and impacted communities makes this sort of approach to self-assessment problematic, right? So can we measure it, and what meaning would such standardized measurements really have? But the success of area expansion has spurred marine conservationists to advocate for even higher targets. For example, the 30 by 30 campaign that aims for 30% marine protected areas coverage by 2030. 30% is now a serious contender for the next set of CBD targets. It's currently in the draft of the post-2020 agenda. I just want to highlight that this figure really would have been laughable in 2010 when the Aichi targets were being negotiated. People just couldn't imagine 30% area coverage. So we're arguing that, this map doesn't just document this MPA expansion. It tells a story of global oceans increasingly conserved and makes further expansion of marine protected areas, higher and more ambitious targets like 30 by 30, imaginable and even possible. In other words, the map is both a product of ocean conservation, but also productive of it. But if these targets or if these areas are neither effectively nor equitably managed, we have to ask, what is the map really showing? And what do we do with equity? So while it may be difficult to incorporate it into a metrological regimes, there are also real dangers of leaving it out. For example, in an analysis of the Millennium Development Goals, Arun Jacob finds a significant relationship between the quality of a goal's performance measurement system. Is there indicators? Are there baselines? Do we have data available? These things are related to performance success. Things that are not included, or that are included but are not fully articulated in this sort of measurement regime, are simply not done. So with this understanding of metrological regimes, right, and the concerns of equity at heart, we have to ask, or we have to read these maps, I think, maps of progress with a certain amount of caution. The map can't be the only measure of MPA success or of MPAs as a marine conservation tool. So how we account for equity remains a really formidable task, but I think one that we can't bypass. And I will stop there.
Lisa Campbell, for our informative and interesting presentation. I hope the participant will continue ask any questions on the Q&A tab, please. So the speakers will try to answer on that tab, or maybe after the last speaker presented. So thanks again, Professor Lisa Campbell. I will now go to the next speaker, Dr. Virginie Tassin Campanella, with the title Legal Perspective on the Challenges of Implementation of SDG 14. First, let me read Dr. Tassin Campanella biodata. Dr. Virginie Tassin Campanella is founder and director of the law firm VTA Tassin in Paris, Geneva, and Zurich. Attorney at law at the Paris and Zurich Bar. She is a member of the Scientific Council of the Economic Law of the Sea Institute of Monaco, International Council of the Brazilian Law of the Sea Institute, member of the IUCN World Ocean Group, expert for the IUCN French Overseas Territories, and expert for the World Bank. Dr. Tassin Campanella is an award-winning law of the sea scholar in Lima 2011 and Brazil ESD-SC 2016. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Tassin Campanella to deliver his speech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahmoud, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's actually a pleasure to be here. And I have to say I'm particularly excited to be, I think, the only lawyer attending a conference designed for non-lawyers. So this is fantastic. So I'm just going to share my screen, and should be okay. So basically, I'm going to talk today about the challenges of implementation of SDG 14, and this is really a legal perspective. To give you a bit of insight of my work, I'm actually indeed heading a law firm that I have created. I've been working a lot on continental shelf issues, and I'm giving mainly advisory services and representation services to government organizations, but also the private sector, including the Earth observation sector. So basically with this presentation, I thought actually starting by giving you a bit of context and understanding a bit more why we've been adopting Agenda 2030, how is it different, and basically why is this instrument actually interesting. So Agenda 2030 actually finds its roots in the UN Conference on the Human Environment, which was held in Sweden in the 70s. And this United Nations conference was really the first one recognizing the importance of the environment in basically everything that we do and plan, from social or economic development. And it's been adopting actually two instruments, the Declaration of Stockholm and the UN World Charter for Nature, which was actually a set of common principles to inspire and guide in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment. What was very interesting is that since the 70s, there's been this acknowledgement of the importance of economic and social development for basically the maintenance of peace. So sustainable development was created around this idea, as well as the Law of the Sea was created around this, creating a set of tools to make sure we maintain peaceful relations among states and actors. And it's been highlighting also the responsibility of citizens, community, enterprises, institutions at absolutely every level. So the call to all stakeholders actually didn't start in 2015. It started in 1970s, but there's been issues of, I will say, implementation and understanding actually of how it could be done. So a few years later, basically the UN General Assembly recognized that more should be done and decided to actually establish an independent commission called the Brundtland Commission, which really emphasized the link between economic and environmental issue and really democratized in a way the concept of sustainable development, which became actually the foundation of the Earth Summit in 1992. So basically, Agenda 2030 was not the first agenda on sustainable development, also gathering NGOs and the civil society. And there's been, as Professor Campbell actually mentioned just before, there's been other instruments, including Agenda 2021, adopted at the Rio, the Johannesburg Declaration, the Millennium Development Goals, which have been replaced by Agenda 2030. So basically, the goal of Agenda 2030 was a sort of recycling and rebooting of what existed and what needed to be included to make it more efficient, actually. The goal was to be more precise, more inclusive, with more guidance, including the targets that have been developed in the previous presentation. And the mechanism has been a bit different, put at the center the issue and surrounds the issue with all the stakeholders, governments, but also the private sector playing a very important role in this agenda. Very importantly, also, it's the first time that we have an ocean goal. So it's making really a big difference in terms of also investment opportunities. So before moving on to more precise examples, I wanted to talk also about implementation in very general terms. So what I'm going to say is actually also complementary to what Professor Campbell actually presented. What is important to know is that Agenda 2030 is not binding. So basically all actors, including governments, are implementing it on a voluntary basis. What is very interesting on a legal basis is that sometimes you have more enthusiasm for what we call soft law, so non-binding instruments, because you actually don't engage responsibility in the same way than, for example, implementing provisions of a treaty. So there's been like a lot of attention given to Agenda 2030 and sometimes even more than other instruments where you have like proper binding obligations. What is interesting also is the grid that has been created. So all the SDG are interlinked. And the goal was there actually to create synergies and to boost creativities of all different actors. So don't leave it to the hands of governments, but also open it to the private sector, to individuals, to experts, to academia, to the civil society more broadly, to actually boost the creativity, the initiatives, because simply there will be more diversity of thoughts, more methodologies, and therefore more initiatives. What is interesting with the targets also on a legal point of view, and I think again it's complementary to what Professor Campbell said, is that the targets actually are broad. So the way you draft something, you can always draft it in a really precise way. Not, for the goal of communicating or not communicating is not my point, but only for the goal of guiding actually the implementation. By drafting broad targets, you leave space actually for various implementation strategies. And so you leave space for creativity. The issue that has been faced actually in the last 5 years is the fact that, generally speaking, SDG 14, but also the targets have been implemented vertically, but not vertically and horizontally. So there's a sort of linear implementation, and I will say only a sort of activation without effective implementation. So I think the example of marine protected area is a very good one. There's been a lot of declaration with actually no management or real protection of the marine environment behind. There's also correlated issues such as green and blue washing, I'm sure you've heard of, which is a very important legal issue where you can see a lot of actors and entities just making a lot of publicity and flagging, I've been implementing SDG number 2, number 14, number whatever. So this is problematic. An issue also of accountability, transparency, and also something that we can see and that is not new actually is the fact that we don't have sufficient and reliable data to really assess the implementation and review actually how we should improve it. Of course, another one that I'm not going to mention, but I know that has been covered in the conference actually this week, is the impact of the COVID crisis, which is actually kind of putting in question the possibility of implementing many targets with economic crisis actually coming. So this is here only an example. I apologize because it's actually in German. But I think with the numbers and the colors, you can recognize pretty well the different SDGs. This is an implementation scenario, for example, and a way to implement actually holistically SDG 14. So now that I've been actually covering, I will say, the basics around the Agenda 2030 and SDG 14, I've been actually selecting 4 points for actually examples of implementation challenges of SDG 14. And the first one actually is linked to the limits of the territory or the limits of the jurisdiction of states. And I wanted to talk first about maritime boundaries. So as you may know, often regions that are very rich in resources are also often zones of conflicts or disputes between states. So it could be because they have oil and gas resources, but it could be also because they have very rich fishery resources. So what is done usually and what is required? Well, under what we call the Constitution for the Law of the Sea, the Bible for us, states that have actually signed and ratified this convention have to follow specific processes to solve their disputes peacefully. One of the ways to do it is actually to enter into negotiation. And then if it doesn't work, you go through a judicial process, you go before a tribunal or a court. But just the simple process of negotiation takes a long time. I'm not talking about 3 to 5 years, but more to 50 or even 70 years. So the issue with this is that boundaries are an important way to support natural resources management, and of course the implementation of SDG 14. And often areas where you have disputes and conflicts, area rich in resources, there will be, because of these conflicts, there will be no investments, barely no developments of the zone, and probably no management of the ecosystem. Another point of importance is the fact that these dispute and conflict zones have a direct also impact on the marine environment. And for example, resources could be targeted or threatened, and there's usually an increasing amount of illegal activities such as illegal fishing. So what could be done actually with these issues of conflict and disputed zones, and the fact that negotiation can take time, so you can't have boundaries being agreed like this? Well, there's a mechanism actually in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is called the Provisional Agreements, which actually allows states, while they're actually negotiating a boundary, to enter into an agreement and create, for example, joint development zones. So this is like the joint development zone is a sort of bubble where you create the role that you want for the activities that you want. So you can co-manage, co-explore, or co-exploit, for example. And this is the example of what's happening at the moment with Mauritius and Seychelles for the extended continental shelf. I wanted to mention also one delicate point around maritime boundaries. The targets at the moment are saying that around 40% of maritime boundaries are left to be agreed. I have to say that I disagree a bit with this number, simply because I'm not sure that actually includes all the potential disputes and open disputes related to the extension of the continental shelf. So as you know, many states have been actually submitting extension claims before a specialized commission at the UN. And a lot of them are actually waiting for the recommendation to extend. So those waiting for the recommendation to extend don't have any management plans or long-term plan at the moment. So there's no implementation of SDG14. And even those actually who had a recommendation from the Commission, I will say most of them, it's the same. They don't have any management plan or strategy to protect or preserve the marine environment. And this is due to different factors, the lack of knowledge and understanding also about the deep sea environments, the clear lack of long-term planning, which results actually in the lack of implementation of SDG14. The other points that I wanted to mention very quickly related to boundaries is the issue of climate change. So as you know, climate change can cause sea level rise, which is actually affecting baselines, which are used for the making of maritime boundaries. So under the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, coastal states actually are obliged to adapt their charts when they are faced with changes. And the issue is with sea level rise that it could be progressive, and shifting baselines can actually lead to a situation where a boundary no longer complies with the rules of international law. So that means that another state, a third state to this boundary, are no longer bound actually to respect it. So when to modify this boundary, how many times you have to modify this boundary? Of course, you can't enter into the negotiation process, every 3 years. It's impossible, and the negotiations are extremely long. So there's a lot of legal questions around this, and a lot of questions linked also to the management of natural resource in these areas. And the Pacific region has been really leading the way, advocating, for example, for fixed baselines and working on specific projects. So the last point that I actually wanted to talk about today is biodiversity, science, and the law. So some of you may be aware that at the UN, the only negotiations we have at the moment is actually negotiation on the law of the sea. So it's actually showing the importance of the ocean in the legal field and in international relations. So the BBNG agreement, BBNG stands for biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, and it's an agreement, not a treaty, which is supposed to be binding when it's adopted, and it will be actually added to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it's a mechanism to kind of update the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea by adding specialized agreements with specific and specialized rules. What is interesting with these negotiations is that Agenda 2030 have had a very important influence in this negotiation. So it's interesting to see how soft law, which is supposed to be, by reputation, not interesting and not effective, can actually really have a very powerful effect even on the negotiation of binding agreements. One of the manifestations of this influence is actually the fact that there will be, if adopted again, a public consultation process open to all stakeholders, allowing not only governments, but of course all the type of stakeholders, including native peoples, private sectors, experts, to participate. What is interesting also with this agreement, despite the fact that I can't cover actually all questions, is the dynamic we have between science, data, and basically policy and law. And there's an initiative actually within this agreement to integrate what we call a clearinghouse mechanism, which should be led by the IOC UNESCO, to centralize and share the data freely to actually all stakeholders for the sake of biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And this dynamic is also central and key to the UN Decade of Ocean Science that we've been talking about. So this UN Decade of Ocean Science, which is not binding, and it's led also by the IOC UNESCO, is creating a cooperation framework at the international level to boost and really spread the use of ocean science. So what is interesting is that the definition of ocean science is not only, I will say, hard sciences, but also social sciences and all the sciences actually dealing with the ocean. So it's very inclusive. It has a very important role to play in capacity development, capacity building, technology and knowledge transfer, which is also central to the BBNG agreements. And it has a role of connecting the dots basically between all the fields of ocean science, which is, I have to say, a very difficult task because, in reality, really working between, for example, lawyers and scientists is not something very common, and there's clearly a lack of methodology and understanding actually between the different ocean sciences. So the thing that I wanted to mention with the UN Decade of Ocean Science, and again, it's a legal perspective, is the fact that on a legal point of view, there might be issues with the sharing of free and open data related to areas within national jurisdiction. So as you know, the UN Decade of Ocean Science is really trying to boost and promote scientific research to increase actually ocean knowledge and the management of the marine space. But at the same time, marine scientific research was one of the most difficult topics that has been negotiated in the 70s for the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And since the 70s, it's been still extremely sensitive, and there's been a lot of barriers to marine scientific research even nowadays. So states actually still stay extremely sensitive and precautious with marine scientific research for the simple goal of protecting their resources and their own territory. So they're not really willing to share openly data actually for areas within national jurisdiction. So there's a sort of dialectic that is interesting, especially with the development of new technology and observation systems that is actually included in the UN Decade of Ocean Science. And I will say it's something that will be interesting to address and actually tackle, not only the methodology to how this ocean science should interact, but also what type of middle ways we could find, what could be shared, to who, for what, and under which conditions. So these are still actually questions to be answered, and I will say, like, I'm very curious to have this question answered because it's a very difficult legal topic. So I thank you very much for your interest, and I will be very welcome to have questions. Thank you very much.
Very much, Dr. Tassi Kapanela. Very interesting presentation. As a lawyer, I think when I talk about law of the sea, I've found it is, very, I think Dr. Captain Brian Conan may be aware also when we teach this category A, category program at our institute by IHY5G and ICA. I think this is really makes sense. I think to have a lawyer giving the talk on the law of the sea as given here by Dr. Tassin Kamanela. So I'm like to thank Dr. Tassin Kamanela, for attending this session. Thank you, Doctor. So now let's move on to our next and last speaker, Captain Brian Conan. He will talk about remote operations, survey impact and opportunities. But before that, let me read Captain Brian Conan biodata. Captain Brian Conan is a U.S. Navy retired, became Vice President Ocean Mapping at Celdron Incorporation in December 2020 after serving as Director of the University of Southern Mississippi's Hydrographic Science Research Center since 2018. A 28-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, he directed the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency's Maritime Safety Office, served as Superintendent of the U.S. Naval Observatory, Deputy Oceanographer, Navigator of the Navy, Deputy Hydrographer of the Navy, a Commanding Officer of the Navy's Fleet Survey Team. A certified hydrographer, he holds a Bachelor of Science in Geography from the University of South Carolina, and Master of Science in Oceanography and Meteorology from the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California, and Master of Science in Hydrography from the University of Southern Mississippi. He is a Chartered Marine Scientist, Hydrography, and Fellow of the Institute for Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. He also served as editor of the International Hydrographic Review and is a trustee of the Hydrographic Society of America. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to call Captain Brian Conan to deliver his speech. Over to you, Captain.
Thanks, Razali. Can everyone hear me okay? Checking the mic. Can you hear me all right? No one is confirming they can hear me. Can you hear me?
It is fine. We can hear you.
Okay, everyone. I can't tell if you can hear me, so I'm going to press on. Someone please let me know if you can't. I'm checking. Yes, we can hear you. Okay, thank you so much. So what you might be wondering what remote operations have to do with SDG14. And I think what really jumps out at me is many of the objectives and the goals of SDG14 require us to map, explore, and characterize our oceans. In order to do that, we kind of have to put more assets to sea. And if we stick with traditional conventional ships to do that, we're actually adding more risk to accidents or damaging the environment that we're actually trying to go out and protect. And so what I want to talk about is how not so much the use of uncrewed systems to do this work, but talk about as surveyors and as data processors how this is affecting us, and both in good ways and bad ways, but what other opportunities there might be for those who may not have had opportunities in this field before. So first, remote operations are certainly on the rise. And when I say remote operations, I am talking about uncrewed vessels, whether aerial, surface, or underwater, conducting surveys. And as you can see here, what the market drivers are we mapping the bottom strictly for safety of navigation purposes? Are we mapping areas for offshore wind farms? Are we doing oil and gas exploration or maintenance of pipelines? Are we looking at cables? There is so much going on in our oceans, and the requirements for having knowledge of the seafloor just continue to rise. Certainly, COVID accelerated the growth in this remote operations area. Here in the U.S., many of our survey ships were tied pierside and were not able to get underway during this time, and those gaps were filled in many cases with uncrewed systems that could go over the horizon, be controlled and monitored via satellite communications. And it could also was impacted with ships that did go to sea, had to go to sea with reduced crew sizes. And so small boat operations you couldn't necessarily do them because you just didn't have enough people on board. And there were these long quarantine periods before you could actually get on board the ships. And so you weren't allowed, your time at sea was actually limited. So, I think COVID was a factor, but this move towards uncrewed systems and remote data processing was already underway. And of course, as hydrographic surveyors, if there's a way to get it done, we will get it done. And that's what we saw happening here during the pandemic. Now, when we look at what the advantages are of remote operations, the first thing that pops up is safety and comfort. On the right, you see pictures of the manual things we have to do while we're aboard ships and in small boats, whether that's lowering instruments over the side or having to bring a launch back aboard during heavy seas. Very difficult work to do. You can see this is up on the left there. That's up in Alaska, so pretty extreme conditions can be had there. It does allow us to work from our home or from an office and look at these operations, either controlling assets or data processing from a very comfortable location. When we look at work-life balance, all of us who go to sea know that when you go to sea, it's all about work, and your family life and other things can take a hit while you're gone, but being shore-based or even home-based allows you a lot more flexibility in going to the children's events or other family matters that you may not have been able to attend before, but now you've got that flexibility. And in many cases, you can choose to live somewhere and work from a place that actually is beneficial for you. High cost areas you can move away from and live maybe closer to family in a low cost area, as long as you have the requisite high-speed internet connection you would need to do that work. And we can say improved health, and living on a ship for long periods of time, it takes a toll on your body. You can't necessarily get a good gym workout in. The food is generally high calorie, not necessarily healthy, although there have been great strides made towards improving the food on board a ship. And then on the next bullet here, I talk about increased productivity with a question mark. Like an unmanned surface vehicle can work 24/7. You don't have to come in at sunsets, and so you can actually have assets working longer. And if you query a lot of people, they will tell you that they feel more productive at home. They feel that they're in a comfortable environment. They like their setup, both their computers and their monitors, and they can get a lot done at home. I think COVID is skewing that effect a little bit. I saw a few studies that in fact showed that there's maybe a 1 or 2% improvement in productivity at home, but if you feel you're more productive, you likely will be. And then are there corporate savings, from the industry side to doing these remote operations? You can give salary incentives to work from home, or reducing your own physical infrastructure. Maybe you don't actually have offices. I know of some companies that have gone completely work from home, and they don't have to pay the lease on the building that they were in before. So there are certainly some benefits there. Again, I think there's more to see and more to follow on how that will all play out at the end here of the pandemic. But I would say remote operations are here to stay. Now, I will say that there are also disadvantages. We are the human animal, and so interaction with other humans outside of our house is an important thing for us and our well-being. We lose that face-to-face contact. You lose the ability to walk around the office and ask a question directly. Instead, you're maybe doing a chat session or an email. And from a surveyor's perspective, we were all raised on you go out, you collect the data, you process the data, you make the product, and you have a sense of ownership of that product, of that survey. And if you're doing everything remotely with unmanned systems and data processing, someone else's project, you kind of lose that sense of ownership. Now, I mentioned that it was healthier to work at home, but not necessarily. on board a ship, you're getting up, walking around, going back and forth, and at home, it can turn into a very sedentary workplace. You do a lot of sitting at your desk and eating at your desk, things that you would do at the office. And so I think there has to be a consideration of making time to go out, walk around the block, get some fresh air, do the physical activity that you should be doing. But then that mental health comes in, have interaction with someone face to face, which as COVID lessens, hopefully that will improve the opportunities to do that. The loss of sea time and pay. I was in the Navy for a long time. I like going to sea. Surveyors go to sea. One of the reasons we do, so you see the picture there in the bottom of a NOAA ship up around Alaska. Beautiful scenery. There are a lot of advantages of going to sea that just from a personal experience that would be lost. So on the flip side from the previous one, is there a loss of productivity? Do people check in at home or into their systems and then actually not do the work that you expect? And so there are many discussions about how do you track what your employees are doing at home. There are distractions and multitasking. I'm sure all of us have seen the cat or dog or small child come into a Zoom meeting while you're trying to have a discussion. Those things are certainly going to be more prevalent at home. Not saying they wouldn't happen at work either, but there are a lot of opportunities for that at home. And then again, back to that corporate infrastructure, what about the data security of your operations? Do you have proper virtual private networks in place and cybersecurity so that the data that you are working on for a client remains protected? And then added equipment. So if you're going to have folks work from home, they are going to need to be outfitted with all the proper gear that they need, whether that's computers and monitors and those types of things that, to set up that home office. And then to me, Luigi talked about the Empowering Women Project at the IHO, which is fantastic. In my mind, remote operations open opportunities for persons with disabilities. And maybe someone who was a surveyor or was a data manager, maybe had an accident and can no longer go to sea and didn't have the opportunity now to do the work they were trained to do, or people who are born with the disabilities or want to get into the field. Remote operations give them that opportunity. Certainly the pandemic has opened the door because all of us became remote workers, but there are a lot of opportunities to do data processing, piloting vehicles online, monitoring systems on board ships online, or building those final products that I think really allow us to reach into that untapped workforce and expand our diversity and inclusion efforts beyond just gender or race, but also to persons with disabilities who have so much to offer us. And some stats there from the US on how many people have disabilities and how many of them around the world do. It's quite a staggering number in my mind. So I think there needs to be a bit of a push here on making that door even wider for these opportunities. And as we're learning, working remotely and controlling systems and vehicles remotely requires a new skill set. And most of our traditional training programs are very ship-centric. If you look into the IHO S5, S8 standards, they are working hard to keep those up to date, but they are still very basic. And when I look at what my teams do as we operate remotely, the types of networking and satellite communications, cloud processing, virtual machines, all the things you see here in this word cloud, those are not things that you are going to get in those programs. And I think it's something we need to address as a community of how do we train surveyors or how do we train our data managers with this? And I'll discuss that in my last slide. Data volume is certainly an issue. As remote operations expand, the communication bandwidth is not necessarily expanding at the same rate. And so we can't move the data from the platform to the processor very efficiently at the moment. Now, new technologies that are coming online with low Earth orbit satellite systems that are going to offer more connectivity and higher bandwidth are certainly things that we're keeping an eye on. But in the future, I would imagine that our systems would actually be doing their acquisition of data in a cloud native format. And that's going to take a lot of time and very reliable communications. As you can see, the comms are that limiting factor. You know, if you're close to shore and you've got a good cellular LTE connection, that works really well in most cases, or a Wi-Fi connection. But once you move outside of that range and you start using satellite communications at sea, unless you're willing to spend a lot of money, the bandwidth is very small. And if you're trying to use smaller platforms, you can't put those big satellite systems on board that you would have on board a bigger ship anyway. So that's really an area that I think we'll have to keep pushing industry to improve. And then my final point here is that cybersecurity has to be considered. You know, our data is worth something, and our vehicles are certainly worth the effort. So we have to be careful not to provide avenues for cyber attacks or other nefarious activities coming into our networks and either corrupting or stealing the data that we're working so hard to collect. So on my final slide, I want to give some challenges out to these remote operations and what we need to do in order to make it work so we can achieve the goals of Seabed 2030 and map the oceans. We're not going to be able to do that with the current fleet of ships. We're going to have to use remotely operated and monitored vehicles, whether they are small in nearshore unmanned or uncrewed surface vehicles or offshore ones. These systems need to be robust, and our technology and our hardware and software on board our systems are not built for unattended operation. If you're on board a ship, it's very easy to go, hey, we're seeing something wrong with this sonar, let's go down and reset the card or check the cable connections. That luxury is going away. And so I challenge industry to start looking at how to build the hardware in such a fashion that it can run for months without having to be touched by a person. Same on the software side. We spend a lot of time as surveyors monitoring multi-beam sonars and GNSS. We have all these small windows open displaying all this information that we're trying to take in. Let's make it simple. Let's make it so that the systems become smart enough to recognize themselves when they have a problem, make the corrections where they can, but then alert an operator via a dashboard or even a phone call that says, hey, I've got a real problem. I need you to remote in and actually do something on board the vehicle. Data volume, again, I talked about that before. That is an issue. How do we do data compression? How do we integrate, and that next thing, the communications, how do we integrate those communications that are coming online quicker into these systems so that we can offload data or do automated onboard processing so that when that uncrewed system pulls into a port, the data that gets offloaded is already processed and ready to go into a production pipeline. Again, that threat of cybersecurity, how do we protect all that throughout that process? For academia, if you're not constantly enhancing and improving your program, whether it's a Cat B or Cat A, with these topics, you really should. It will benefit your surveyors to do that. Talking to them about advanced networking, looking at actual data science and metadata, and how do we do those things within our academic programs, and potentially considering, continuing education programs or certificate programs that can augment your existing programs that you can quickly field and modify so that people can actually get this advanced knowledge that currently isn't required by our IHO standards. And then for the IHO, keep working on the S5 and S8. Be ready to adopt and adapt to the ever-changing IT environment and communications environment. Start looking at how we're processing in the cloud, how we're using artificial intelligence and machine learning to process our data. All these things are moving very fast in industry, and I know it's difficult for standards to keep up, but they have to be considered. And then my final point is, with MSDI and with all the data management that we struggle with, perhaps there's a need for a new standard to focus on hydrographic or marine data scientists, data managers. Something to consider so that we can allow surveyors to focus on surveying and allow our cartographers to worry on production, but that data management and doing more with the data as it's collected would certainly be a very useful role for marine data scientists in the future. So that's all I have. I appreciate the time. Really thank FIG and Razali for inviting me to speak, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Captain Brian Conan, for informative presentation. I think we are very grateful for your presentation. So because the time is almost up, after this, I hope you can all go to the Ask Me Anything AMA session. The link, I think, is already shared. So I think we can continue from there for the participant to ask any question to the four speakers. But let me just finish this session by thanking all our speakers. We have IHO Director of HO, Admiral Luigi Sinapi, who talk about oceans knowledge, the role of the International Hydrographic Organization in the incoming decade. And we have a Marine Affairs and Policy Professor, Professor Lisa Campbell, who talk about maps as measurement, marine protected areas, and global conservation targets. And we have a lawyer, especially on the law of the sea, Dr. Virginie Tassin Capanella, who talk about legal perspective, implementation of Captain Brian Conan, who talk about remote operation, survey impact, and opportunities. So it's actually a very unique group of presenters here. A director of IHO, Marine Affairs Policy Professor, a lawyer, and a hydrographic surveyor. So it's truly a unique session that I hope the rest of the participants will stay and move to the AMA session, so that you can ask questions to the our four speakers. I saw already in the Q&A, Admiral Sinapi already answers one of the questions posed by the participant, but there's one question to Dr. Tassin Capanella there. So I will post. I will refer this to Dr. Tassin Capanella once we are in the AMA session. So please join me in thanking all our speakers for the enlightening and great presentation. So thank you very much. So let's now move to the AMA session. See you there.